Good evening, class. For today's discussion board post, I've decided to answer question number 2. The question asks, is asymmetrical warfare a new idea? Describe its history and evolution with some emphasis on Vietnam. No, asymmetrical warfare is not a new idea. Of course, we know asymmetrical warfare means one side typically fighting conventionally and the other side not conforming to the traditional rules and engagements of war. Some examples of asymmetrical warfare are guerrilla warfare, terrorism, and insurgency. Many forces will use unconventional or asymmetrical methods because they typically cannot compete conventionally with the opposing force. So, the history of asymmetrical warfare can be seen as early as the Chinese military manual Sun Tzu's The Art of War. And a quote from The Art of War states, "When the enemy advances, we retreat. When the enemy halts, we harass. When the enemy seeks to avoid battle, we attack. When the enemy retreats, we pursue." So I think this definitely shows that the traditional views of war would seem as if it would be moral, that when your enemy advances, you advance. However, the quote says, when your enemy advances, we retreat, which is obviously the complete opposite. As well as when the enemy seeks to avoid battle, you do not fight. But Sun Tzu says when the enemy avoids battle, we attack. So, however, Sun Tzu is saying you do the opposite of what we would view as the traditional ways of war. So the use of asymmetrical warfare evolved and continued from Sun Tzu's time through the Chinese Civil War and eventually adopted by the Vietnamese historian and general, I'm going to try to say his name, Vo Nguyen Giap, in his campaign against the French and later used against the Americans in 1945 and 1975. So, despite the history and evolution of asymmetrical warfare beginning in Asian styles of fighting, like we previously saw, the United States did witness asymmetrical warfare way before the war in Vietnam. Many examples of this are the Indian used unconventional tactics against the English settlers, for example, ambushes, and hiding behind trees and rocks before attacking. Next, during the American Revolution, the Continental Army could not compete with the British Army because the British Army was well advanced with a larger army, better quality weapons, and experience because obviously the British had been around longer and had been around so long that they were able to build up this large army. So therefore, the Continental Army would take part in ambushes to try and defeat its enemy because it could not compete. Other times the United States faced asymmetrical warfare is the Filipino insurgency during the 20th century. This is where, to explain this, after the Spanish-American War, the Treaty of Paris allowed the United States to purchase the islands from Spain for $20 million. However, many of the Filipinos were unhappy, so the Filipino insurgents under, I can't pronounce his name, but under a leader attacked American forces in Manila on the 4th of February, 1899, and they used guerrilla warfare for this attack. And so this resulted in the insurgency that continued until 1902. So despite all these encounters with asymmetrical warfare, Vietnam was the most extensive and traumatic for the United States, according to Snow and the readings for this week. The Vietnam War had started out as conventional warfare or symmetrical warfare between the North Vietnamese Army and the Viet Cong against the Army of the Republic of Vietnam. The United States stepped in to help, and we saw this shift from symmetrical to asymmetrical because the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese Army knew they could not defeat the United States. Therefore, methods of asymmetrical warfare consisted of guerrilla warfare, like ambushing American troops in the jungle. They did this to avoid as much interaction or much direct interaction and face-to-face contact, because if they were able to surprise them, then they were able to catch them off guard and ultimately beat them. And also, they attempted to wear down American forces as well as draw the war out as long as it could go, so that public opinion in the United States about the war demanded the United States to leave. So after the United States left, the North Vietnamese Army and the Viet Cong ultimately went back to conventional or symmetrical methods like they had previously did before the United States entered the war. So, therefore, we have seen that asymmetrical warfare is not a new concept. It has been used many, many times throughout history and even history of the United States, in using asymmetrical tactics. So, thanks for viewing my post, and I look forward to hearing your comments. Have a great weekend.